Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9PBS.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this edition of Donnybrook. Great to have you with us on this rather sultry, hot Thursday. We have a terrific guest coming our way for Next Up. The Conductor Laureate of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, Leonard Slatkin, will be our guest. And Ray and I will be throwing questions to Maestro Slatkin. Looking forward to that. And we also have an all-star panel to take on the issues of the day for our region, starting with Sarah Fenske, who's the host of St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis NPR, KWMU. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Charlie.
And we welcome for his debut appearance on Donnybrook, Ryan Recker from KMOX, where he's the co-host of St. Louis Talks every day at 11 o'clock with Carol Daniel and Bo Matthew. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
And one of our founders, Mr. Ray Hartmann from rawstory.com, the Riverfront Times, and of course, the Big 550 KTRS. Ray.
Thank you for having me.
And Mr. Alvin Reid, the news editor from the St. Louis American, who rounds out our panel. And Alvin, I think this is probably the cheeriest we're going to be all half hour. I mean, everyone's so pleasant right now. But you did a great job last week, Alvin. I sure appreciated you moderating.
I didn't know where that was going.
Hey, let's start with
Ryan,
you.
Are you a tri-host? Is that what you call when you have three people on a radio show?
Yeah, well, kind of. It's kind of hard to get a word in, but I think it prepared me for this very moment.
There you go.
You think it's tough to get a word in on that program? Wait till you spend the next 26 minutes with us. Okay, Sarah Fenske. Census numbers have come out after data was collected for the 2020 census. It has been determined that our region grew 1%, while the nation grew 9%. There were some crazy numbers here. St. Louis City's population is down 5.5%. It is still over 300,000 at 301,000. Franklin County was up 3%. Jefferson County up 4%. St. Charles up 12%. Lincoln County up 13.3%. Warren County up 9%. In Illinois, St. Clair and Madison County both down 4% and 1% respectively. What was rather unusual, I thought, is that census takers concluded that in the city of St. Louis, we lost 1 out of 5 kids. That is individuals under 18. That number went down 20%. Do you believe it?
I actually do believe it. I think this reflects some longstanding trends that the St. Louis Public Schools have talked about and that other demographers have noticed, which is that lower income families are leaving the city. And they are moving, for the most part, to places like North County. But when that's happening, what you see happening is that there's 2-family homes that were relatively affordable. They're being converted into much bigger homes, and who's moving into those homes are often couples without children, couples who have a maximum of 1 or 2 children. And so the population of school-age children in the city has been in decline for quite some time now. And so while this seems like a pretty big jump, I actually believe, based on what we're seeing in some of these quote-unquote hot St. Louis neighborhoods, that this winnowing out of lower and middle income families is, this trend, you could see a sharp acceleration in the last 10 years.
I just think it's a little bit too high. I listen, I could believe it, and I believe that it's a factor, schools, a lot of other things. I just think, a lot of discussion is about undercount when the census comes out. But, with every undercount, there technically doesn't there have to be an overcount? And I think it'll play out that way. Now, is it like 2% instead of 20%? I don't think that either. But if it was closer to, put it this way, if it was 10%, I would think that's about right. If it's 15%, I wouldn't be surprised. I think 20% is too high.
Well, I can't quibble about the numbers because as a city resident, I am desperate to stay above 300,000 residents. And so, I want to take these numbers to the bank here. I don't know about the specifics, but I do think as far as the trends go, it's really interesting what's happening in St. Louis. We're losing less affluent population, and you're seeing the city demographics change. I think we're going to see this just accelerate in the next 10 years. I don't know if that's a good thing.
Well, that 20% drop for kids seems, that does seem rather big, a big 1 out of 5 leaving. And, you know, they often say in statistics, if the number seems too big, then, you know, it has to be questioned. But Charlie, there's no doubt, you're right. I mean, not only the public schools, but the Roman Catholic schools have also seen huge drops in their population.
Charlie, I think that it's a significant number that, to Sarah's point, and a surprising one to me. I had seen the numbers I had seen that were kind of just projections of what the city population would be by now were like 293. I thought for sure, I thought it was actually good news for the city and a significant thing that it stayed over 300. I know it's psychological, but it's less of a decline. If you look at the overall region, the 1% growth is pretty consistent with what most projections out there are. And it's like, it ain't great. It could be worse, but it's as a region, it's St. Louis has been pretty stable, but not growing. And but I can see where different ways to parse the issue of the kids, and obviously it's got to be a significant concern. But I thought on balance, it was actually pretty good news for the city.
Well, I think overall, if you're growing at 1% as a region, you're in trouble for federal dollars, for congressmen, even for getting airlines to service your airport. If the rest of the country is growing at 9%, that is.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, Ryan, let me ask you about the St. Louis County Council, which this week, in its wisdom, voted, we think, 5-2. Although it wasn't a roll call vote, it was a voice vote. But it pretty much seems as if 2 members voted for a mask mandate. That would be Lisa Clancy and Kelly Dunaway, and the other 5 voted against having a mandate. I thought that was surprising, especially since Shalonda Webb had said in an early press release that she was for a mask mandate, but didn't like the procedure that had been used earlier to carry one out. Overall, what'd you think of the vote of the St. Louis County Council, Ryan?
I think this shows that there could be 2 things going on, and I think there could be a trust issue and a respect issue. So if you look at the trust issue and some of the advice that we've been receiving, and going back to the statement of Dr. Khan in the past, there could be some people burnt out and thinking to themselves, what do I trust in a moment like this? And certainly when you have a public comment period where they'll open it up to 2 hours, and then there's still a crowd waiting outdoors ready to speak about this sort of thing, and a wide majority of the people are against the mask mandate. I think the people really need to be listened to in a moment like this. And I think the lack of respect comes in when you're a Dr. Sam Page that won't rely on the system, and to say that, you know, I'm going to do it the way I want to, regardless of what the council wants to do it. I'm going to try to move forward, and we'll see how the courts handle it, or if the attorney general steps in. So when you have that kind of lack of trust and lack of respect going back and forth, it's a bad combination, because politics has just been eating each other up in the county, and nothing's getting done. And there's so many other issues on the table right there. It's so hard to look at that and say we should do anything at this point.
Okay, I'll be specific with our 2 council women who voted with the 5 and made the majority. The districts that they represent are predominantly African American, who are being hit by this, you know, the pandemic, much harder than most of the regions in St. Louis County. So when you start talking about, you know, who you're basically, you know, the politics of it, the politics are that their seats are safe. Okay, they could, and I'm not saying, in my estimation, do the right thing, although I think that, look, I think they should have voted for the mask mandate, if for no other reason than that's who you represent. And who cares what the rest of the council people think? Your districts, if you're representing them, and more people are dying and more people are getting sick and less people have vaccinations, then you're not representing them to the point where I think that they elected you to do. I don't live in those districts, but I will tell you that, you know, I think they're being irresponsible to the voters that put them in those seats.
Yeah, well, let me argue this, though.
There is something to representing the people who voted you in, as opposed to trust, and I don't like Sam Page, and all this. All those other things are ancillary.
I will say this, though. Who had been in charge, though, for vaccinating those areas? So when you're a Dr. Sam Page and the executive, and you actually hire someone as a liaison in order to try to get all of the different areas, if they're lacking in vaccinations and these areas are lacking behind, it's actually a reflection of the county executive and the plans that they put forward to try to get those areas. So as a county councilwoman, if you were looking at that and saying their plan isn't working, you got to do something different. I don't blame them saying no mask mandate, because what they were doing wasn't working.
I don't know. I think that.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry. I think in some of those districts, the vaccination rates are quite a bit lower because these are people who soldiered through the pandemic. They had to go to work. They had to ride the buses. A lot of people sheltered at home, worked out of their basement, and in less affluent districts, that wasn't always an option. And so there's a little bit of like, hey, I got through this. This isn't going to be so bad. Not saying it's the right move, but I wonder if their districts are as wound up about wanting masks as, say, the sort of upper middle class Webster Grove types that Lisa Clancy represents and Kelly Dunaway represents.
I think it's a broader look at it more from 40,000 feet. This is just dead wrong as public policy, not to be, and I understand it's not by any means a local story. It's all over the country. It's dead wrong. Now, I happen to have a great regard for Rita Hurt Days, who I think has done a great job as chairwoman and continue to, and Tim Fitch and the others. Well, maybe all but one of them. But I have to tell you, this is just wrong. I mean, we are in a serious pandemic. This is the idea, and none of us likes to wear masks, but the idea that we should be, vacillating about a pandemic over the inconvenience and trying to create a human freedom that says I have the right to endanger other people's health, and regardless of what the public health experts, because we now have moved into this era where we don't trust the public health experts. Now, I agree with Ryan about one thing on the second half of what you said, which is Dr. Page has a style that disrespects the St. Louis County Council. There's just no getting around it.
But hey,
and
can I jump in here?
Process, and he made it worse on himself. But Page is right on this issue. Let's be clear. It isn't even ambiguous.
I got two thoughts here. One, I think the masks, we tried that before, and with social isolation and other measures, and the numbers went up, 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 up. The key to all of this is the vaccine. And I think that the masks are a head fake and a distraction from what we really need and the vaccine. And I disagree with Ryan. I don't blame it on Sam Page. He has been out there all the time telling, get the vaccine, as all of these elected officials, locally anyway, have been doing. It's the individual. I cannot blame the government for the lack of vaccines. For some reason, people in Missouri have been reluctant to get the jab, and I don't understand it. I blame them. I do not blame Sam Page. I don't blame Mike Parson, anybody.
Dr. Brennan, I don't know about you. I've had a bunch of, and you have much more access to there's many people than I do, but every doctor you get on, every medical expert, every infectious disease expert says masks work. And to conflate them with the shutdown. See, the kind of argument that's going on in the county council meetings, these people with the pitchforks and torches, who, by the way, don't speak for us, because those of us that are on the sane side of this don't want to go to a super spreader event and waste our time at a county council meeting. But the point is this, that you cannot have this idea. If we were arguing about an economic shutdown, I'd be with you. Fine, that would be a terrible idea. A mandate, masks and the economic shutdown are two different subjects.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, you talk about how cases went up when people were wearing masks. We don't know how high they would have gone without that. I mean, we're seeing a bit of this now. We had our couple months of freedom. I don't know about y'all, but I was out there going to the bar, going to restaurants, not wearing masks. And I think that's why we're seeing some of the massive spread we're seeing right now.
I think I saw you.
Well, Ray says that no doctor, poo-poos the masks. Actually, Marty McCasey from Johns Hopkins University, along with a colleague from Tufts, both said, look.
St. Louis, no self-respecting St. Louis area.
Well, I think everybody knows, though, Ray, the vaccine is the key. And here we are talking about masks when the answer, everybody knows, ask those same doctors, what's the answer? It's the vaccine. And we're taking our eyes off the prize.
No, they're not.
We are.
There are two. This is not it'd be nice if the pandemic was like more cooperative and the virus. This is a complex thing. The idea that it can only be vaccines, it can't be vaccines and masks. Like, why do we can only, our brains can only assimilate.
The CDC said so just 2 months ago. I mean, they said basically if you're vaccinated, you can go indoors.
It'd be nice if everybody's vaccinated, but that doesn't mean that a combination of vaccines and masks.
We're not going to wear masks forever. We're not going to do it.
That doesn't matter.
But the vaccine can end this.
Vaccines and masks as a combined strategy are the way to go. And the entire medical community would accept Dr. Benny Boom Bots thinks that it does.
No,
I mean,
and Charlie, these same people that want to stop the masks are the same people that in Jefferson City decided that they wanted to stop vaccine passports. It's like, if we're going to go vaccines, we got to go harder on vaccines.
I don't want to misquote Marty McCasey. He's a distinguished professor and from the medical school at Johns Hopkins. He does believe in masks, but he has said that in schools anyway, they're probably the fifth important thing behind ventilation and distancing and working in pods, etc. Nonetheless, let me ask you, Alvin, about Eric Schmidt, who was hounded by Jack Suntrup of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who is asking all the candidates for U.S. Senate, those seeking to replace Roy Blunt in the upcoming election, whether they are vaccinated. And it turns out that Vicky Hartzler and Billy Long are vaccinated. McCloskey has not answered the question. Eric Greitens hasn't, to the best of my knowledge. Eric Schmidt, the Attorney General, who wants to become a U.S. Senator, he was caught. He says, yeah, I'm vaccinated, but it's a personal decision. What'd you make of this?
Well, my first reaction, and this is kind of to that, professional sports side, that if it comes up like, are you vaccinated? And I don't want to tell you, I jump to the conclusion that they are not vaccinated. On the political side, thanks to Sarah Fenske earlier, I actually listened, and I'm thinking like, oh no, it's politically, expedient for me to not say, because I don't want to admit that I am vaccinated, that's more shameful really than anything that's going on at City Council. In that, listen, if you're vaccinated, you should tell people you're vaccinated, and you should say that they too should be vaccinated. And it's bigger than you trying to be a senator or for whatever office that you're running for. Now, hypocrisy and just doing whatever you need to do to get in office, that's been running wild on that side of the aisle for a few years now. It's sad, but it's a reality.
I'll tell you what a reality is for Eric Schmidt in the knuckle dragger world he's living in. There's only one right answer, which is that I wasn't vaccinated. Okay, for his base, for the Republican primary for Senate, the only correct answer is I'm not vaccinated. I don't believe it. Well, obviously, he didn't choose to lie, to his credit, I suppose. So what's the next best thing if you're Eric Schmidt? Make it about the media. Make it, which is out of the Trump playbook, make it about the mainstream media, all this coming after us and intruding. Make yourself a victim of the media, if you got to say it. It is a really smart political strategy to change the subject to whether the media should be hounding him about this.
Yeah, I think Eric Schmidt is one of these guys, kind of like, frankly, Eric Greitens, former Democrat, who he's trying to appeal to this base that isn't his natural base. And so you have a guy like Billy Long running for this same seat, congressman representing Cape Girardeau area, and he's able to confidently say, yeah, I've been vaccinated. I hope my constituents get vaccinated, because he knows people aren't going to challenge him as like his conservative, his boot heel bona fides. He has those. Eric Schmidt doesn't have them. Eric Greitens doesn't have them. Mark McCloskey, St. Louis trial attorney who lives in a Midwestern palazzo. These are the guys who may have to dodge the question. And I think it's terrible. I think it's a completely fair question. One of the great political questions of our time.
Especially since it was reported last week, I think by The Atlantic, if I'm not mistaken, that people in rural Missouri are wearing disguises when they go to the drugstore for their vaccine because they're afraid their neighbors will see them getting the vaccine. Crazy. Ray Hartmann. By the way, I appreciated the Rodney Dangerfield reference earlier, Dr. Vinnie Boombots. Want to ask you about Sarah Walsh. She's a state rep who I believe is running for Vicky Hartzler's seat. She's a Republican. Her husband is her press secretary. He's Steve. Steve and Sarah both came down with COVID-19. Neither were vaccinated, and can't remember exactly the reasons they gave for that. But Steve last week was on a ventilator, and I guess we hope he's doing well. But he does bring up the issue of that's really, I think, paramount for the medical industry, which is why I really think that many doctors are saying, "Hey, let's tackle this thing." They're running out of nurses, they're running out of beds, and there are people who are having heart attacks or who have heart disease, or even some elective procedures, like they're getting, new hips or whatever, and they're completely inconvenienced by the Steve Walshes of the world who are in the hospital, and it all could have been prevented, his hospitalization, had he had that vaccine, because we know that 98% of the people with COVID in hospitals were not vaccinated. So I think that hospitals should readjust their triage procedures and say, okay, if you are in the hospital with COVID-19 and you elected not to get vaccinated, you'll take a back seat to some of these other patients. What do you think of that?
Not much. I disagree with you on that. I will say this. I wrote about this week in the RFT, and it was a little delicate because on one hand, Sarah Walsh was asking for prayers after she and her husband, the press secretary to Vicky Hartzler, Steve, had very, really vocally opposed vaccines. I mean, said they weren't getting it. Steve had done a lot of retweets of things making fun of vaccines. And I'm not one of the people that wants to in any way exploit that. I hope he gets better. My understanding is he's still on the ventilator as recently as far as I can tell. And I'm told, it's a real dire situation for him, to be honest. And Vicky Hartzler, of course, was pro-vaccine. But as far as the hospitals themselves, we can't. The hospital's job is to save people's lives, and we, of all the things we don't want to get politics into,
but
we can't.
We know that more people died of heart disease last year. There was a big jump, and a lot of people are saying it was because of hospitals and the fact that they were spending so much attention on COVID, and a lot of people were dissuaded from going to the hospital.
You cannot. We don't look at somebody at heart disease and ask what caused it. We don't look at cancers and you just can't go there. I don't think we can. We cannot. Hospitals have to be saving lives, period, without regard to politics.
Well, Charlie, I've talked about churches before, and people bring, the whole, I have the right to bring a gun in church. Church is a place of tranquility, and if people do not want guns in there, that's right. Well, the hospital is a place of mercy, and I wouldn't ask them to boot out the gunshot victim who was dealing dope on the corner. He or she is there. You have to help them, and so I'm going to waive, whatever I feel of why you're there, because they just have to save you because you're closest to death. And you use the term triage, and that's what it's about. Who's closer to dying, okay? Mm-hmm. And if you're close to dying, then that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. And let me point out one other thing. The internet's really good at dancing on your grave. So if they find something like this out, you can look at all the mean comments. But I think one of the big criticisms going back to even 10 years ago when Obamacare was brought out was the idea of a death panel, which is we're going to decide who lives and who doesn't. So if we think you're not worthy of a bed, we're going to give that to someone else. And that, I think, was widely rejected. They thought that was the wrong way to go. Now, given that they were probably talking about the elderly and someone that might never recover, to give the bed to someone else. But if we're going to look at that exact same scenario and say, because you were not vaccinated, you're not worthy of treatment, if someone else comes in your place, I think it's the wrong way to do it.
I don't think that death penalties were ever a thing. I think they were a thing the Republicans did.
I actually have interviewed a medical ethicist, and they have to make decisions all the time about who they treat and in what ways they treat it. So I get Charlie's point, but boy, that is the worst slippery slope, and I'm terrified if we as a society decide to do that.
Well, you are treating people like adults when you treat them the way I suggest.
And that's not something our society does, Charlie.
I know, but I feel the same way with people who ride motorcycles without helmets. And, I think that they should pay more for insurance, for example. I think smokers should. And I think that insurance companies should have the right to say, no, we're not going to fund your accident. We're not going to help you if you are the result of a scuba diving
but
or
it's the hospital.
rock climbing
Ryan,
incident.
Ryan, I don't know if you have children, but I think all the rest of us do. Now, I don't know if they do it. I don't know if they do it anymore. But did you ever see, that bill that you don't pay when your wife or Sarah, when you have a baby? Okay, it's like a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
And so we don't turn moms away who show up at the hospital and are going to have a birth. And it costs just as much. And so because, we just don't do that.
Charlie,
and so same with this bill.
We have one more topic.
Torn on half at everything. We can at least agree on not leaving people on the concrete outside the emergency room. We have to.
But right now, those emergency rooms are jammed because of the lack of nurses. Okay. Final one. Sarah, Governor Pritzker in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, signed a bill forming the Illinois High-Speed Railway Commission, trying to set things in motion for high-speed rail connecting Chicago to St. Louis and vice versa. You think there's a lot of demand for Chicagoans to come here really quickly?
I don't know if they want to come here, but man, I'd be there every weekend. 2.5 hours to Chicago. I love that city. Yeah, I think this is great. I hope they do it. I hope they can pull it off. There is nothing about the state of Illinois that gives me any assurance that they could pull this off, but I want to believe.
Well, that's a great.
And we can hyperlink to Kansas City. Come on, Charlie. We can go from Chicago to Kansas City.
You can connect it to the loop trolley. That's correct.
Oh,
Good point.
Doing a nice ad for the CBC. All of us said, I don't know if they're going to come here, but we want to go there. No, I love that response. I have to tell you, I am so pro bullet train, and I understand that it's probably not happening in our lifetimes, but I'm like, yes, let's do it. Do it.
Yeah, I think the infrastructure in the United States is built in a way where it really disincentivizes that sort of thing. But if we look at other examples of these trains being built, California had a great example of it. They put a track together that was less than half the size of what's being studied between St. Louis and Chicago. And the cost kept rising and rising, and the date of completion kept going back and back. They got to $100 billion, and they couldn't even complete the thing. So I don't know if you want to dedicate $200, $300 billion to build this sort of thing if you get that benefit out of it.
Well, I just think other nations have done it successfully.
Donnybrook. Those are facts.
And in America, we can do anything anybody else's country could do, and they're done and done well in other countries. So I think we could do it between here and Chicago.
Yeah, just because, speaking as a former California resident, just because that state is ungovernable and just cannot figure things out, it doesn't mean the rest of us should give up.
Sarah, thank you. Your comments will be the last ones for this program. We sure appreciate you joining us. We'll be listening to you on KWMU. Ryan, thanks for your debut. We'll be following you on KMOX. Gentlemen, we'll see you next week. But Ray, don't you go too far, because you and I will be talking to Conductor Laureate of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, Leonard Slatkin, on Next Up.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9PBS.
Thanks for joining us for Next Up. This is where we interview community leaders, and we're so proud, Ray Hartmann and I, to welcome Maestro Leonard Slatkin to Next Up. He's, of course, the Music Director Laureate of the Detroit Symphony, Honorary Director of the Lyon Symphony in Lyon, France, Conductor Laureate of our St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, the winner of 6 Grammys, the recipient of the National Medal of Arts, also holds the rank of Chevalier in the French Legion of Honor, and has just penned a new page-turner, which will be published on September the 15th. It's titled Classical Crossroads, The Path Forward for Music in the 21st Century. Well, Leonard Slatkin, Maestro, welcome to 9PBS.
Very nice to see you again, Charlie and Ray.
And we know that you are scheduled to conduct the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra at Powell Hall in October, but COVID is posing a challenge for American orchestras, is it not?
Not just American orchestras, it's all over the world. And as we're speaking, even today, I'm hearing some of my very good musician pals who've just been prohibited from going to Europe to perform again. So this is going on right and left. We have not progressed that much at all, at least for the performing arts. We are playing, when we do for audiences, limited size. Some obviously have audiences in masks, and some even have members of the orchestras wearing masks. I've had to conduct a few programs with that on. And can you imagine, for a conductor, if I did this, I've taken out a great number of the tools I need to conduct. It's like asking the flute player, well, you can play, but you can only use 2 fingers. So we're limited in what we can do, but we do try to do our best.
Mr. Slatkin, first of all, so I think I don't normally speak for St. Louis, but I think I can speak for people, how excited everybody is that you moved back to St. Louis, about 3 years ago, correct?
That's correct, but I really never had much doubt at all. There are 4 generations of Slatkins that are connected with this city. My grandfather on my father's side came here at the beginning of the 20th century. My father was born here. He even played in the orchestra and lived here for 19 years. I was here as a resident conductor for 27, and my son was born here. So 4 generations of Slatkins, there really wasn't much choice.
And is it true that a certain baseball team weighed into this decision?
It did. It was often, it was very difficult being away because the first move I made, Washington team, when I got there, and of course I went immediately to Congress. It took 10 years, but I got them a baseball team. That was all my doing. People need to know that. And then after that, I went to Detroit. Now I was stuck with the American League for 10 years. And I had to get out of there, so I needed to come home to my boys in red.
Is it true when you were in Washington, D.C., that someone who substituted with you, fill me in, was President of the United States, Bill Clinton?
It was true. We had rededicated the concert hall. It needed a drastic acoustic as well as visual overhaul. We had 2 dedicatory concerts, and I invited the president to come and conduct. He could not rehearse, so he invited me to the White House, where we spent 25 minutes. I was supposed to basically give him a conducting lesson, but it turned out he already knew how to conduct. He was asking me about how do I show down my slowing procedure with the beat and how do I do this. It was very clear he knew what he was doing. It did turn out he was quite nervous, though. He was a little bit worried. I got to introduce him because the audience didn't know what was going to happen. And I just said that I'm tired after all these years of conducting in Washington, the Stars and Stripes Forever. And I wanted to turn it over to our new assistant conductor, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. And out he came and he started. And what was very cool was that he even wrote it in his autobiography, that it was a memorable occasion for him, simply because for the first time in all of his years in Washington, he got 100 people to follow what he was doing and what he was
It was almost 50 years ago that your mother gave us one of the greatest leitmotifs in American music.
Yes.
Would you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, my parents were very much part of the Hollywood musical scene. Almost anybody watching us, listening to us, will have heard them because my father was the concertmaster, first violinist of the orchestra at 20th Century Fox. My mother was the first cellist at Warner Brothers, and her brother was the pianist at Warner's. But after 1956 and the end of the McCarthy era, all of the studios as we knew them changed. They were no longer contract actors, directors, musicians. So all musicians went and played with every studio. My mother just bounced around from one to the other, always as the first cellist. And the last sessions she did as a cellist in an orchestra or as the principal for a still relatively young man named John Williams. And he was doing this little movie with somebody named Spielberg, something to do with a fish, I think. And then there were these 2 notes, da 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 da. And as John often pointed out, my mother was the first person to literally scare audiences worldwide. And I would always tell John, no, she was scaring all of us well before that. she was Jaws.
Well, Maestro, in addition to your obvious the greatness that you have, one of the distinctive features, which I learned when I had the honor of having you on a radio show, is how many different symphonies you have conducted, either as a resident conductor or as a guest, a visiting and guest conductor. Talk about that. Why you chose everywhere, not only in our country, around the country, but all over, certainly our America. What drove you to do that?
Well, with my whole family being in music, and this goes back several generations, there was pretty much no question that I would go into some aspect. At first, I thought I'd be a violinist, then I thought I'd be a pianist, then I thought I'd be a composer, a few other things. And eventually, after my father passed away, he was only 47, I was 19. I kind of left music for about a year and a half, thought I would be an English teacher, but friends and colleagues wanted me to get back into music, and they thought I should continue the path that my father began on but hardly could complete, and that was as a conductor. So I began my studies and wound up here in St. Louis as the assistant conductor in 1968. I had no idea how far I would get in this career, in this business. I didn't think about it. I just knew that of all the things in music that I had done and attempted to do, this was the one I felt the most qualified for, the one that I felt I could do the best. And what a life it's been. I mean, I've traveled all over. I've conducted literally all the major orchestras in the world, been in almost all the major opera houses. And the joy of making music with disparate musicians, different backgrounds, different languages, different approaches to the music. You're in a constant state of learning. As we're talking, just a week ago, I was in San Francisco working with a combination of distinguished professionals from all over the country, but also combining them with students who'd come all the way to San Francisco from Taipei, where they'd spent 2 weeks in quarantine before they could even enter the States, and then another 2 weeks waiting to work together. And yet we produced a miraculous set of concerts together. And maybe that's the glory of it for me, the idea that you never stop learning. You always have this incredible contact with people who are dealing with the history of the world, but using notes instead of words.
Here in St. Louis, Stéphane Deneuve is our conductor now, and he's from France. And then from the UK this fall, we'll welcome Stephanie Childress, who's a 22-year-old phenom, but both are from outside the United States. And in your new book, you take a look at the changing landscape for American conductors.
Right. It's a very similar time as it was when America first began to have symphony orchestras. We didn't have Americans as conductors. The first real American to emerge on the international scene was Leonard Bernstein. But even then, people who ran American orchestras came from other places, as did most of the musicians. So we went through a period when I was here in St. Louis, Michael Tilson Thomas was in San Francisco, Marin Alsop's in Baltimore. There were a lot of American music directors in the 80s and 90s and just into the 2000s. Right now, and it's purely by coincidence, there's nothing planned about it, the 20 top budgeted orchestras in the United States are all headed by people who are not from the United States. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it does seem to me to beg the question, are we doing something wrong that we can't put our own native grown talent in those positions? And probably that's more of each orchestra finding the person they believe is best for their ensemble and for their community. I know of many Americans who I think are deserving of having positions, and I think most of them will get them eventually. It's just right now we're in this very, very strange time. Think about it. You have a combination of pandemic, you have Black Lives Matter, you have woke movement, you have cancel culture. It's like every cultural disaster that could befall us has hit all at once, and we have to learn how to deal with it. That's kind of what the new book is about, looking at what was different in the 20th century and what's different now, and perhaps looking at solutions. So for Americans who get a little perhaps dispirited because they don't see opportunities for themselves moving forward in this industry, I think it will turn around in a different way. I think eventually people will find other folks that were like me and found a path to get to where they will be the heads of the major institutions. I think we're very close now to having our very first female director of one of the truly major orchestras. It's not far off. Again, this is something we would never have thought about 15, 20 years ago, and yet we're getting close on that front. One of the other things in the book that is similar has to do with the idea of diversity within our field. The classical music industry is always thought of as being the dead white male Europeans, and it's been that way for a long time. There are little examples along the way that have changed, and now we're beginning to see the emphasis on diverse groups, minority groups, maybe to the point where we're overdoing it, but it needs to happen in order to come to some form of normal. Let's see how things play out. I think it'll look different in the next year and a half, but we need to give people of diverse backgrounds more opportunities to show their potential gifts. If it turns out in the long run that there are not as many there as we think there should be, that's how it will balance. But we don't know that yet. We have to find them first.
Maestro, your book, of course, is called Classical Crossroads, right? For those in possession of Google. But to follow up on that and to your comments about the culture changing, I know there's a chapter on audiences in your book, and have the audiences and the environment and the experience of the symphony changed, and if so, how?
They've changed a great deal. And one of the best ways, two quick ways to really explain it, is when I arrived here as the assistant conductor in 1968, in my first year, I did 83 children's concerts. 83. We played not only in Powell, we went to the different schools. I remember playing out at Kirkwood at 8 in the morning. You don't want to do that to a professional orchestra ever, but we did it. And then we usually play 2 concerts, and they would bring them often into the gymnasium if they didn't have an auditorium someplace, or they'd come to Powell Hall. Not that orchestras don't have education programs now, but they're nowhere near as numerous. More important than that, there are more and more schools, not only in this country, but in Europe, that don't have proper arts education. I'm not talking just about music anymore. We're just talking about an understanding of what goes into making a cultured society. The great works of art, the books, the poetry, the sculpture, the painting, and the music, of course. So that's been the big change. We've lost so much ground in the education of our young people. And I have a kind of solution. One of the things about the book is I decided that if I'm going to criticize how things might be, I need to offer solutions. Whether they're right or wrong is something else, and hopefully it has some degree of controversy and provocation. But I think the solution to this is actually pretty simple without spending a lot of money, because even commentators who normally wouldn't be on board with arts education, their chief argument is it's going to cost too much to do it, even if they believe that arts education should be in our public school sector. Well, it wouldn't be if, in addition to training our history teacher and that force of people who give information to the students, give them a little background in the arts. When you have the Napoleonic era and you're discussing the French Revolution, couple that with listening to the opening of the Third Symphony of Beethoven, where Beethoven, the Emperor of France, and you can hear that anger. You can hear the seed of the French Revolution in his offering. And imagine if we just started, we're discussing elements of this country as we entered the 20th century, and we use, say, Scott Joplin as an example of how that music transformed society, but placed it in the context of history. I don't expect anybody to just say, oh, I'm going to study arts and become an artist. No, but I think it should be a basic part of any young person's education. And now we really don't have as much as we should.
Well, it's a different society. Remember when the Huntley-Brinkley report used to open up to, was that Beethoven or Bach?
Beethoven 9, second movement.
Yeah.
Dum, da, da. And people got to know the sound of the timpani because that was that solo instrument. Now, of course, any classical music we usually get on TV is usually put in the form of an advertisement, and it's usually altered to a degree that you don't recognize it. And maybe it shouldn't be there in the first place. I'd like to think that there's original music still out there. My son is a composer. He's writing for film and television out on the West Coast. He'll look for Daniel Slatkin. Look for that name in a few years. He's going to become important. But I'm hoping that he'll be one of these people that can influence how we listen to music and how it affects all of us in all kinds of media.
For sure. Let me ask you about the diversity of orchestras. The St. Louis Symphony Orchestra turns out to be the first majority female orchestra among the big orchestras in the United States, and that's kind of neat. But some people think that maybe that screen, which is used in auditions, should be removed. For a long time, the players, when auditioning, were behind a screen, so the judges couldn't tell if they were tall or short or white or black or anything else. Do you think that screen should be removed?
I have a solution for this one too. So I'm old enough and remember when the screens first went up. And that was in the 1970s. The reason they went up was because a black timpanist in San Francisco, who was with the San Francisco Symphony, was not granted tenure, and she sued on the basis of racial discrimination. She lost the lawsuit, but it did provoke a major change. And all of a sudden, auditions were done where everything was anonymous. You couldn't see who the person was. You didn't know anything about their history, their background, where they studied. And for that time, for about 35, 40 years, certainly, I think it was valuable. We needed to have a change. And the focus was certainly just on how well do they play. Now things have changed. Most orchestras are very much with a large female population, but we come to a catch-22 now, and that's a very unfortunate one. If we are wanting to achieve more diversity, how can you do that if you don't know if the person behind the screen is diverse or not? For me, I would like to see, and maybe I have to do this quickly. What happens is there are usually 3 rounds in an audition. Everybody can play in the first round. Then there's a sort of semifinal round where it's down to 10, 12 people, and then usually down to 4 or 5, all done behind the screen. And with a committee of 7 or 8, sometimes 12 people listening behind the screen. So nobody knows each other. Let's say that maybe out of that committee, one person is a racist, maybe one musician is a misogynist, who knows, but the others are not. And we've gotten to the point where I believe musicians are going to be fair. They're going to listen and to see somebody without a prejudice here. They're going to try to pick the best musician. But being a musician in an orchestra now is about more than just playing in the orchestra. It's about community engagement. It's about what they bring to the job that perhaps is not seen on stage. I know at auditions, it was frustrating that I couldn't go up to a person playing and say, could you try that again? But I'd like to conduct you through it to see how well you follow me. So my solution here is do the preliminary auditions behind the screen. The music director's not there anyway. And by the way, there are orchestras where the music director does not select the people playing in the orchestra. It's becoming more and more decision for the orchestra themselves. So do the first round that way. Then you get to your semifinals. Screen comes down and you have in front of you who they are, where they studied, where they played before. Because another problem is we've been experiencing another form of discrimination, and that's against those people who have experience. You cannot put someone who's been in an orchestra for 25 years up against a kid who's coming out of conservatory at age 19 or 21. They can just knock the socks off all the repertoire, and the experienced person maybe doesn't have that set of chops the same way, but the experience factor can make a big difference. I don't mind orchestras being populated by so many young people, but unless there's experience to balance it, your orchestra isn't going to grow. And more people, because of the pandemic and other reasons, are choosing to leave orchestras. You'll see, even here in St. Louis, I'm going to guess there are more vacancies right now in the orchestra than they could have anticipated a year and a half ago. And they're going to have to fill them. I'd like to see experienced people come in as well as the new young crop.
Maestro, I remember it's been a while helping lead the charge for the symphony to be included in the Zoo Museum District. And
yeah,
with my help, that turned out like
I remember that very well.
And one of the things said back then was that people have a perception, or at least then, that it's too elitist for symphonies. And it's ironic to ask that question on PBS, which is, rather synonymous with classical music. And particularly someone like myself, I guess the three of us have a National Medal of Arts between us, but I'm going to be the third. But how is that something, I mean, so much of what you say and what we hear from the symphony is about the community. Do you think that perception of elitism is still something you have to battle, or do people more accept the community role that the symphony play?
I think the word elite is actually not a negative word. I think we should all strive to get better, to elevate ourselves. That's what the word means. So I don't take it as a negative word, but I understand how people use it that way. So I think that St. Louis and other orchestras have done a very good job generally of reaching out to a broader audience. You remember in my days as an assistant, what did we do to put us on the map right away? World premiere performance of Jesus Christ Superstar. I never had any problem crossing over into other forms of music because I was brought up that way. It wasn't a problem for me. But the basic core element of an orchestra is to present mostly the masterpieces, much like a museum has that, but then they have their separate collections of contemporary art or unusual pieces. There's only so much that we can do. And the arts world and the music world has to be very broad. It's the Duke Ellington quote that everybody loves. There are only two kinds of music, good music and the other stuff. So part of our job, I think, as an orchestra is to do exactly what other institutions like the Art Museum, the zoo to a lesser degree, they're kind of stuck with the animals, not too much else, but they can present big studies on the environment, other issues of the day. Orchestras can point people to other kinds of music, but in particular, I think the main job of an orchestra in the next 10 years is going to be to really work hard to develop true education in our school system. And I think, as I mentioned with the auditions, I think part of that job is going to be taking those people who come into an orchestra and saying, this week, instead of playing in the orchestra, you're going to go to such and such school, and you're going to develop a music program over the course of a week. To me, this whole idea of what an orchestra can be is no longer just about playing Beethoven and Mahler and Strauss. It's about this active part it takes in the community. The old, I guess it's still there, the commission, and it still does a good job, but it also has to focus its attention not just on the artists, but on the education of the young people to potentially grow into that arts community. One of the great things about moving back to St. Louis is this joy of discovery. I go around to little places. It can be a deli here or a small antique shop there. And I go in and sometimes people recognize me, sometimes not. But I try to think about how they're part of the environment of St. Louis, their contribution in the community. St. Louis is a city where you have to discover things. I didn't know that there were like 15 restaurants serving crab. I have no idea. And I only found that out by driving around and saying, hey, what's this crab place and all that? And then I'll go in and try them out. Or Little Gala. I didn't even realize we had a large Asian population on Olive Boulevard. I didn't know that when I was here before. It wasn't there before, it turned out. Or as you go down Grand, all these wonderful little boutiques and shops and all that. That's the stuff St. Louis is about, discovery, finding all these places. And that's more of what the regional arts and the orchestra and the museum, getting out there, being a group that's together, not in competition. That Zoo Museum District thing, that was tough back then because the orchestra tried to become part of it and that didn't work out very well. And then they went on their own. There was another thing that's important. The leadership in the city was different. The names I'll say now will only be familiar to a couple people, but you had Stanley Goodman, you had Lee Jardine, you had Buster May, you had Robert Orchard, down the line, all these people, leaders in the community, on the boards, and Joe Pulitzer, and so many others, elegant people, people committed to the city. We need to find that leadership in the current crop of younger people in the community today. Get them involved in all these aspects so that they become not just business folks, but real community activists. And
Maestro,
I think we've done.
Well put. Unfortunately, we're going to have to invite you back and pick it up from there because we're
I'm
flat
sorry,
on
that's
time.
unfortunate.
No, thank you very much. We wish you the best with your new book, Classical Crossroads. And we know, of course, that you're going to be at Powell Hall in October, stlsymphony.org. Maestro Leonard Slatkin, thanks for joining Ray and me on Next Up here on 9 PBS.
You take care of yourselves.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9 PBS.